Welcome to part 3 of the lecture videos on global marketing. And in this part, we'll talk about the third P, promotion. And so promotion simply means communication strategies, the way that the company tries to get the word out about its product or service. And here we see a variety of communication strategies listed here. Direct selling is person-to-person selling, people going door-to-door, selling directly that way. Sales promotion, of course, there might be a big, price cut and you want to get the word out about that. Direct marketing is when, companies are sending these emails or texts or messages directly to you. And then, of course, advertising and public relations and publicity. So we'll talk about some of these, but some of the key things to keep in mind is some of the ways that these communication strategies or promotion can be affected by certain things like cultural barriers, source and country of origin effects. We're going to talk about both of those kinds of things, the source and country of origin effects, and noise levels. So let me explain those in a little more detail. Cultural barriers, of course, is the thing that, of course, every Thunderbird student learns about cross-cultural communication. You'll be learning about all of these great things in your program, how to get the message across to people in different cultures, how to communicate with people in different cultures. And so that, obviously, when you're doing international business, that's one of the greatest challenges, right? To getting the word out, promoting your product or service, understanding how that will be interpreted or what would be the most effective way to get the message across in a different culture. But there's some other important concepts that I think we need to keep in mind. And this is source and country of origin effects. So let me explain both of those in turn. So source effects means this is when the receiver of the message evaluates the message on the basis of the status or the image of the sender. So in other words, if someone is very prominent or important or has a high status, in the United States, often it's celebrities, right, that people listen to and somehow respect. People then are more inclined to buy that product. If someone is endorsing it, a very famous person, you might say, well, gee, if that person thinks it's a good product, then maybe I should use it too. So this is used in a lot of different ways. When I was doing marketing for a large pharmaceutical company in Brazil, one of the techniques we used is for our pharmaceutical products to make sure that they were being, prescribed by doctors, by physicians in Brazil, is we would make sure that we would, for example, sometimes have a prominent physician, a very well-known professor at a medical school, do the product as do a trial of the product and test it out and see if it worked. And then if they were convinced, then they would tell their medical students, and then those medical students would become doctors and they would prescribe the product. So if a very famous professor of medicine in Brazil was, saying this is a fantastic product, everyone should be, prescribing this, then of course that would have a significant impact, and that would be a very good source effect that would make it easier to sell that product. Country of origin effect is another interesting phenomenon, and so sometimes people have a certain image in their minds of a country, right? And they might say, oh, in China, sometimes consumer products are not high quality or low cost, cheap. They might break, and so maybe they don't have the best image of some of those products. And so to the extent that the place of manufacturing influences, someone's perception of that product or their perception of that product, then you would say the country of origin effect. I mean, this can work in positive ways as well. An example might be, sometimes people will say, oh, that car was made in Germany. The engineering was done in Germany. It must be a very high quality car. And I think we see how these perceptions can change over time. So sometimes people might have a perception. I remember when I was a kid growing up, Japanese products were very low quality, they were cheap and broke easily. But of course, now Japanese products are considered to be among the highest quality products in the world. And of course, China is very quickly developing that reputation as well. So these things change very fast. We had a project we did at Thunderbird with the country of Chile. And Chile was trying to promote itself as a very interesting place for foreign direct investment, not just investment in things like copper and fruit and salmon and wine and those kinds of things. That seemed to be what people thought of when they thought of Chile. But Chile wanted to change its perception that people had and to make itself more interesting for people that were putting in software development centers or research and development institutions and those kinds of things. So Chile made a concerted effort to overcome the country of origin effect. When people saw a product, they said, oh, that's a product from Chile. It must be, nice fruit or fish or something made of copper, right? And so Chile made a really strong effort to try to change its perception that people would have that it might be a great place to consider for investing in, high-tech sorts of investments. And so that's something that Chile had to overcome and has done a great job of trying to do that. So that's how the country of origin can really make an impact on people's perceptions, right? And countries sometimes have to overcome that. Noise level simply refers to the amount of messages consumers are already getting. So if they have a lot of different competing messages for their attention, then of course it's going to be more difficult to promote your own product or service. So these are just some of the key concepts that come into play here. And another one is this concept of the difference between push strategy and pull strategy. And so push strategy is when a company is actually using personal selling. It's selling out maybe representatives going door to door. I think the typical example is Avon. And in Brazil, there's a company called Natura that just recently acquired Avon. So they are involved in the personal selling. They have women that go door to door, knock on the door, try to sell cosmetics, perfumes, those kinds of things. In some countries, that sort of push strategy is very effective. It's very effective in Brazil. Other countries might find that a pull strategy is more effective. A pull strategy is when you just simply get the word out. Maybe you have mass advertising on the mass media, maybe a TV commercial, right, for Nike. And Nike says, we're selling these new kinds of shoes. And then that ad would pull people into the Nike stores. And so you wouldn't see Nike salespeople going door to door, right, selling Nike shoes, but you might see a big TV commercial that then pulls people into the malls. And so in some countries, that kind of advertising might be much more effective. That sort of promotional strategy would work much better than in, let's say, Brazil, where the push strategy could work very well in certain parts of Brazil. So that's the kind of thing that you talk about when you're getting into these promotional strategies. What is the company you're assessing for your group project using an effective promotional strategy? Does the promotional strategy it's using actually make sense for that market? These are some things to consider. And as an international manager, it's something you want to consider when you enter a new market. What sort of promotional strategy are we going to use? The choice is going to depend. If you use a push strategy or a pull strategy, the choice depends on these three factors, really. The kind of product you have, the kind of how sophisticated the market is, the length of the channel. We talked about that. That's how many steps there are from the manufacturing plant to the final customer, how many steps along the way. And then how available is the media? Does everyone have a TV set? Will they hear an ad? Will the pull strategy work? Or do you need to use a push strategy in more remote regions where people maybe don't have the same kind of access to media? So these are the kinds of things. Now, for certain kinds of products, as I mentioned, and in certain kinds of markets, for example, let's just give you this example, consumer goods, right? Consumer goods firms trying to sell to a large segment of the market, masses of people. Well, of course, then it might make much more sense to have a pull strategy. Nike shoes would make sense to have commercials pull people into the stores and then they buy the product there. But if you have a very sophisticated, complex industrial product that is very difficult to explain, obviously you're targeting just a very small segment of the market, very sophisticated buyers. In this kind of thing, then, industrial products, then these complex, sophisticated products, you're going to need to use a push strategy. And salespeople are going to actually have to go to the company and explain why this sort of component would work better than another component. and they're going to have to talk to technical managers and explain all the complexities of that. And so that obviously takes a very different kind of promotional strategy, right, than Nike shoes. So that's why there are these important differences. And of course, the length of the channel has a big impact too. The longer the channel, the more intermediaries there are, right? The more steps from the manufacturing plant to the final customer. And so it can be really expensive to use direct selling if it's a very long channel. To push a product through all the different layers of the distribution channel, that can be very expensive, to hire all those people to do that. So when there's a very lengthy marketing channel, many steps from the plant to the customer, it might make a lot more sense, especially depending on the nature of the product. If it's Nike shoes or something, might make sense to pull the product through the channels by using mass advertising. And that's the way to bring the customers into the store, right? So using a pull strategy would make more sense in that kind of marketing channel. So these kinds of things depend on, for example, media availability. A pull strategy isn't going to work if there isn't ready access to TV, radio, newspapers. If people in a remote part of the country, for example, don't even have those things, the pull strategy is not going to be effective. So, for example, Avon in Brazil, very effective, for example, and I think I've given this example before in another context, but for example, in very remote parts of the Amazon, Avon is very successful in selling its cosmetics and perfumes and those things. They actually have sales people going out, ladies going out in dugout canoes to remote villages in the Amazon, and this sort of push strategy, right, personal selling, having people go door to door actually is very effective in a place like that. And so that works very well. Now, even in big cities, it turns out in Brazil, the city of Sao Paulo, still Avon is successful with a push strategy. A Brazilian company that just bought Avon, it's called Natura, is very successful with that strategy as well. That's why they bought Avon. They were essentially the same kind of company. And Natura, big Brazilian multinational, has been so successful it has grown to have operations in multiple countries all over the world. As I mentioned, they bought Avon. They bought another company, The Body Shop, a few years back. And so Natura, this big Brazilian multinational company, uses this push strategy. They have thousands and thousands of representatives that go door to door. And even in big cities, I think in this case, it's a cultural difference. Sometimes, in the United States, if someone comes to your door, you say, oh, stay away. You put up signs. We don't want anyone there. But in some parts of Brazil, at least, even in some big cities, people don't mind that so much. They say, oh, okay, very nice. Talk to the person. That kind of personal touch might actually work in some cultures more than others. So again, so these are the reasons you might have to decide, is the push strategy more effective or the pull strategy? A lot of factors go into making that decision. So push strategies, generally speaking, are more common, as I mentioned, for industrial products, very complex, sophisticated products where it takes a long time to explain the value of the new component or whatever it is that you're trying to sell. You might need to send a salesperson out to explain that to the plant manager, that kind of thing. Obviously, that's where you're going to need a push strategy. Push strategy is also very good when there's short distribution channels, not as many steps or intermediaries along the way from the plant to the customer. Otherwise, the cost gets very expensive, hiring lots of salespeople to, you can imagine. Pull strategy would be better if it's a long marketing channel. And obviously, push strategies are much more common when there's very few media resources, right? You don't have TV or newspapers or radio. So pull strategies, much more common and more effective for big mass consumer products. I mentioned the Nike shoes example. When there's long distribution channels, and of course, when there's sufficient media, and everyone's going to see a TV commercial for Nike shoes, and then that will pull them into the store. So obviously, you need that kind of presence of the media for that to work. So these are the differences between these two different kinds of promotional strategies. This is sort of the main takeaway I hope you would pull out of this pull. I didn't mean to use that term, but there it came. In this segment. And just a final word, though, about global advertising. So when companies do international advertising, there are some very effective companies at this. J. Walter Thompson is one of them. But even a very sophisticated company with its headquarters in New York and operations all over the world, like J. Walter Thompson Advertising, and I've spoken to managers at companies at J. Walter Thompson Advertising in Latin America, and they've said, you know, even we had to learn sometimes the hard way that sometimes standardized advertising across a whole region doesn't always necessarily work. And we had to understand that even in one region of Latin America, for example, the countries have significant differences. Brazil has very different, you know, culture than, let's say, Argentina or let's say Mexico. And so those differences are so significant that we can't use one TV commercial and just assume it's going to work as well in Brazil as it does in Chile. So these kinds of differences, and of course things like, you know, sometimes countries have different regulations on what kinds of advertising they allow. Those kinds of things, of course, have to be taken into account. So that was just a final word on that aspect of promotion. And now we can turn to the next of the 4 Ps.